It dropped below zero last night. I thought I'd better send Frank out this morning to make a fire for us. No use getting ammonia with the big case on, but I told him not to touch anything except the stove. And you, Frank?
Somebody should have been left here yesterday.
Oh, yesterday when I had to send Frank to Morris Center for that man who went crazy. I want you to know I had my hands full yesterday. I know you could get my back from Ohama, but today, as long as I went over everything here myself.
Well, Mr. Hale, tell just what happened when you came here yesterday morning.
Harry and I started to town with a load of potatoes. We came along the road from my place, and as I got here, I said, I'm going to see if I can get John Wright to go with me on a party telephone. I spoke to Wright about it once before, but he put me off, saying folks talk too much anyway, and all he asked was peace and quiet. I said, you know about how much he talked himself, but I thought maybe I went to his house and talked about it before his wife, though I said to Harry that I didn't know as what his wife wanted made much difference to John.
Let's talk about that later. Mr. Hale, I do want to talk about that, but tell now just what happened when you got to the house.
Hale, you're up.
Oh, sorry. I didn't hear or see anything. I knocked at the door and still was all quiet inside. I knew they must be up. It was past 8 o'clock. So I knocked again, and I thought I heard someone say, come in. I wasn't sure. I'm not sure yet, but I opened the door, this door, and there in that rocker sat Mrs. Wright.
What? What's she doing?
She was rocking back and forth. She had her apron in her hand and was kind of pleating it.
And how did she look?
Well, she looked queer.
How do you mean, queer?
Well, as if she didn't know what she was going to do next, and kind of done up.
How did she seem to feel about your coming?
Why, I don't think she minded. One way or another, she didn't pay much attention. I said, how do you do, Miss Wright? It's cold, ain't it? And she said, it is. And went on kind of pleating her apron. Well, I was surprised. She didn't ask me to come up to the stove or sit down, but just sat there, not even looking at me. So I said, I want to see John. And then she laughed. I guess you would call it a laugh. I thought of Harry and then in the team outside. So I said a little sharper, can I see John? No, she says, kind of dull-like. Ain't he home? Says I. Yes, says she. He's home. Then why can't I see him? I asked her, out of patience. Because he's dead, says she. Dead, says I. She just nodded her head, not getting up, a bit excited, but walking back and forth. Why, where is he? Says I, not knowing what to say. She just pointed upstairs like that. I got up with the idea of going up there. I walked from there to here. Then I says, why, what did he die of? He died of a whoop around his neck, she says, and just went on pleating her apron. Well, I went out and called Harry. I thought I might need help. We went upstairs and there he was lying.
I think I'd rather have you go into that upstairs where you can point it all out. Just go on now with the rest of the story.
Well, my first thought was to get that rope off. But Harry, we went up to him and said, no, he's dead all right, and we better not touch anything. So he went back downstairs, and she was still sitting that way. His body was notified. Has anybody been notified? I asked. No, she said, unconcerned. Who did this, Miss Wright? Said Harry. He said it businesslike, and she stopped pleating of their apron. I don't know, she says. You don't know, says Harry. No, she says. Weren't you sleeping in the bed with me? Says Harry. Yes, she says. But I was on the inside. Somebody slipped a rope around his neck and strangled him, and you didn't wake up, says Harry. I didn't wake up, she said after him. We must have looked as if we didn't see how that could be. For after a minute, she said, I sleep sound. Harry was going to ask her more questions, but I said maybe we ought to just let her tell her story first to the coroner or the sheriff. So Harry went fast as he could to River's place where there's a telephone.
And what did Miss Wright do when she knew that you had gone for the coroner?
She moved from that chair to this one over here and
Pointing
just
to a small chair in the corner.
sat there. There, her hands held together, looking down. I got a feeling that I ought to make some conversation. So I said, I had come in to see John if he wanted to put in a telephone, and that she started to laugh. Then she stopped and looked at me scared.
County attorney who has had his notebook out makes a note.
I don't know, maybe it wasn't scared. I wouldn't say it was. Soon Harry got back, and then Dr. Lloyd came, and you, Mr. Peters, and so I guess that's all I know that you don't.
I guess we'll go upstairs first, and then out to the barn and around there. You're convinced that there is nothing important here? Nothing that would point to any motive?
Nothing here but kitchen things.
The county attorney, after again looking around the kitchen, opens the door of a cupboard closet. He gets up on the chair and looks on a shelf, pulls his hand away sticky.
Here's a nice mess.
The women draw nearer.
Oh, her fruit. It did freeze. She worried about that when it turned so cold. She said the fire'd go out and her jars would break.
What can you beat the woman? Held for murder and worrying about her preserves.
I guess before we're through, she may have something more serious than preserves to worry about.
Well, women are used to worrying over trifles.
The two women move a little closer together.
And yet, for all their worries, what would we do without the ladies?
The women do not unbend. He goes to the sink, takes a dipper full of water from the pail and pouring it into a basin, washes his hands, starts to wipe them on the roller towel, turns it for a cleaner place.
Dirty towels.
Kicks his foot against the pans under the sink.
Not much of a housekeeper, would you say, ladies?
There's a great deal of work to be done on a farm.
To be sure, and yet,
With a little bow to her.
I know there are some Dixon County farmhouses which do not have such roller towels.
He gives it a pull to expose its length again.
Those towels get dirty awfully quick. Men's hands aren't always as clean as they might be.
Ah, loyal to your sex, I see. But you and Miss Wright were neighbors. I suppose you were friends, too.
I've not
Shaking her head.
seen much of her of late years. I've not been in this house. It's more than a year.
And what was that? You didn't like her?
I liked her all well enough. Farmers' wives have their hands full, Mr. Henderson. And then,
Yes.
it never seemed a very cheerful place.
No, it's not cheerful. I shouldn't say she had the homemaking instinct.
Well, I don't know as Wright had either.
You mean that they didn't get on very well?
No, I don't mean anything. But I don't think a place be a cheerfuller for John Wright's being in it.
I'd like to talk more of that a little later. I want to get the lay of things upstairs now.
Goes to the left where 3 steps lead to a stair door.
Suppose anything, Miss Peters, does be all right. She was to take in some clothes from her, and a few little things. We left in such a hurry yesterday.
Yes, well, I would like to see what you take, Mrs. Peters, and keep an eye out for anything that might be of use to us.
Yes, Mr. Henderson.
The women listen to the men's steps on the stairs, then look about the kitchen.
I'd hate to have men coming into my kitchen, snooping around and criticizing.
She arranges the pans under the sink, which the lawyer had shoved out of place.
Of course, it's no more than their duty.
Duty's all right, but I guess the deputy sheriff that came out to make the fire might have got a little of this on.
Gives the roller towel a pull.
Wish I'd thought of that sooner. Seems mean to talk about her for not having things slicked up when she had to come away in such a hurry.
Miss Peters, who has gone to a small table in the left rear corner of the room and lifted one end of a towel that covers a pan,
She had a bread set.
stands still. Mrs. Hale, eyes fixed on a loaf of bread beside the bread box, which is now on a low shelf on the other side of the room, moves slowly toward it.
She was going to put this in there.
Picks up loaf, then abruptly drops it, in a manner of returning to familiar things.
It's a shame about her fruit. I wonder if it's all gone.
Gets up on the chair and looks.
I think there's some here that's all right, Mrs. Peters. Yes, here.
Holding it toward the window.
This is cherries, too.
Looking again.
I declare I believe that's the only one.
Gets down, bottle in hand, goes to the sink and wipes it off on the outside.
She'll feel awful bad about all her hard work in the hot weather. I remember the afternoon I put up my cherries last summer.
She puts the bottle on the big kitchen table, center of the room. With a sigh, is about to sit down in the rocking chair. Before she's seated, realizes what chair it is and slowly looks at it, steps back. The chair which she has touched rocks back and forth.
Well, I must get those things from the front room closet.
She goes to the door at the right, but after looking into the other room, steps back.
Coming with me, Mrs. Hale? You could help me carry them.
They go in the other room, reappear, Mrs. Peters carrying a dress and skirt, Mrs. Hale following with a pair of shoes.
My, it's cold in there.
She puts the clothes on the big table and hurries to the stove. Mrs. Hale examining the skirt.
Right was close. I think maybe that's why she kept so much to herself. She didn't even belong to a ladies' aid. I suppose she felt she couldn't do her part, and then you don't enjoy things when you feel shabby. She used to wear pretty clothes and be lively when she was Minnie Foster, one of the town girls singing in the choir. But that was 30 years ago. This all you was to take in.
She said she wanted an apron. Funny thing to want, for there isn't much to get you dirty in jail, goodness knows. But I suppose just to make her feel more natural. She said they was in the top drawer in this cupboard. Yes, here. And then her little shawl that always hung behind the door.
Opens stair door and looks.
Yes, here it is.
Quickly shuts door leading upstairs. Mrs. Hale abruptly moving toward her.
Mrs. Peters,
Yes, Mrs. Hale?
do you think she did it?
Oh, I don't know.
Well, I don't think she did. Asking for an apron and her little shawl, worrying about the fruit.
Mrs. Peters starts to speak, glancing up, where footsteps are heard in the room above in a low voice.
Mr. Peters says it looks bad for her. Mr. Henderson is awful sarcastic in a speech, and he'll make fun of her saying she didn't wake up.
Well, I guess John Wright didn't wake up when they was slipping that rope under his neck.
No, it's strange. It must have been done awful crafty and still. They say it was such a funny way to kill a man, rigging it all up like that.
That's just what Mr. Hale said. There was a gun in the house. He says that's what he can't understand.
Mr. Henderson said coming out that was what needed for the case was a motive, something to show anger or sudden feeling.
Mrs. Hale, who's standing by the table.
Well, I don't see any signs of anger around here.
She puts her hand on the dish towel which lies on the table, stands looking down at the table, one half of which is clean, the other half is messy.
It's wiped to here.
Makes a move as if to finish work, then turns and looks at a loaf of bread outside the bread box, drops towel, and that voice of coming back to familiar things.
Wonder how they are finding things upstairs. I hope she had it a little more red up there. You know, it seems kind of sneaking, locking her up in town and then coming out here and trying to get her own house to turn against her.
But Mrs. Hale, the law is the law.
I suppose it is.
Unbuttoning her coat.
Better loosen up your things, Mrs. Peters. You won't feel them when you go out.
Mrs. Peter takes off her fur tippet, goes to hang it on a hook at the back of the room, stands looking at the under part of the small corner table.
She was piecing a quilt.
She brings the large sewing basket and they look at the bright pieces.
It's log cabin pattern. Pretty, isn't it? I wonder if she was going to quilt it or just knot it.
Footsteps have been heard coming down the stairs. The sheriff enters.
Okay, could we stop at this point? Okay, so what has happened up until this point? What's the whole thing has begun as an investigation, right? And who are the investigators?
The attorney and the sheriff.
Yeah, principally the attorney is looking for, because he's the one that's going to have to take the case to trial, right? Those of you who are in law. So this guy is looking for some sort of motive, right? That's what essentially. So as investigators yourself of plays, think of yourself as sleuths. Whenever you read a play, you're investigating its details to turn up some way of understanding how it functions. Okay, so the whole point here that the play is making as it begins is in rather there's tension. There's no doubt there's tension, and there's tension particularly by the women. The men, of course, are the sheriff and Hale are trying to give the county attorney some idea of what went on in their view. The county attorney is trying to find a motive. But the women, why are the women here? Why? What do they say? Why are they there?
One was the neighbor,
Yeah, okay.
and then the other girl, Miss Peters, she had to come pick stuff up for her because she's in jail.
Yeah, because and so who ever heard of someone saying, "Okay, I can bring something to someone who's in prison today. Just let me take them something," right? If they ask for something, I'll bring it to them. And this period in time was much looser in terms of the law, and and also the location of the play takes place where? Where are we?
We're in the living room below the crime scene.
Okay, so we're not at the crime scene. Right, so we're in the living room, we're down below, and what does the kitchen normally translate as being symbolically? It's the
Is
location
it
where the women are, right? It's what women locate themselves in the place where they provide the food for the husbands and the children, right? So essentially, this location is carefully construed by the playwright to suggest what the important part of this play is. It's not so much investigating upstairs where the men think the evidence will be found. It's in the place where the women normally collect and work and do things. And the rocking chair itself is symbolic of Mrs. Wright, wouldn't you agree? Because Mrs. Hale doesn't sit on it. She refuses to sit on it. She almost starts to sit on it and then backs up and leaving it to rock. And therefore that rocking motion suggests something about Mrs. Wright and her domain. So the women respect the right of Mrs. Wright to have created the kitchen that she normally would have functioned in. And the suggestion is that she started out making bread, which of course is a fundamental thing to have in a family in one of these rural areas. And so consequently, we see that she had good intentions, but something happened someplace along the way. And so we don't quite know yet what that something is. But the playwright is giving you this, all of this stuff becomes filler for you to understand who Mrs. Wright was and who her husband was. These are two characters that don't appear at all in the play. But they're very important because they are depicted through the lines of particularly the women. The women and the suggestion that Mrs. Hale has something to tell the county attorney about who Mr. Wright might have been. But he says he wants to deal with that, but he puts it off. He puts off dealing with it at that point in time. So again, this is all meant to attract and hold your attention so that you want to know, well, what happened, right? Isn't that the fundamental thing? At the end of this scene, we want to know what happened. And Mrs. Hale says to Mrs. Peters, well, what, do you think she did it? And we begin to see that Mrs. Hale is on the side of Mrs. Wright, but she doesn't quite understand why at this point in time, why she should be. So we don't understand the personal connections and what may or may not transpire as a result of these men looking upstairs and fiddling around upstairs. The women are beginning to look for stuff that they have to take to Mrs. Wright. and they are very careful in what they put together to take to her. And as they are doing that, the playwright has given us motivation for understanding who Mrs. Wright is, and then talking about who Mr. Wright might have been. But we haven't come to the fundamental thing. Plays essentially start with, well, what is as this other book tells you, the Introduction to Play Analysis by Prittner, they tell you that conflict is the center or the hallmark of a play. Conflict and then ultimate resolution of that conflict. And so essentially what has happened here is that we begin to see the potentials of conflict, but we haven't yet found them yet in this play. We are simply, in a sense, in a kind of a stasis situation at the beginning of the play. And the stasis is that these people are looking around, but nothing has happened yet. Something fundamental has to happen before this play can take off. And that something will get translated into the next few scenes. And it will become very important because the women are very much involved in that something happening. Okay, so let's continue with the read. Doing a great job. Thank you. Thank you.
Footsteps have been heard coming down the stairs. The sheriff enters, followed by Hale and the county attorney.
They wondered if she was going to quilt it or just nod it.
The men laugh, the women look abashed.
Frank's
County
fire
attorney rubbing his hands over the stove.
All right. Frank's fire didn't do much up there, did it? Well, let's get out to the barn and get that cleared up.
The men go outside.
I don't know as there's anything so strange, our taking up our time with little things while we're waiting for them to get the evidence.
She sits down at the big table, smoothing out a block with decision.
I don't see as it's anything to laugh about.
Of course, they've got awful important things on their minds.
Pulls up a chair and joins Mrs. Hale at the table. Mrs. Hale examining another block.
Mrs. Peters, look at this one. Here, this is the one she was working on, and look at the sewing. All the rest of it has been so nice and even, and look at this. It's all over the place. Why, it looks as if she didn't know what she was about.
After she said this, they look at each other, then starting to glance back at the door. After an instant, Mrs. Hale has pulled at a knot and ripped the sewing.
Oh, what are you doing, Mrs. Hale?
Just pulling out a stitch or two that's not sewed very good.
Threading a needle.
Okay, now why, when she does this, why is Mrs. Peters concerned about this?
It's like evidence.
Right, it's tampering with evidence right now, the potential evidence. So what's going on is the women, Mrs. Hale in particular, is starting to adjust things. She's starting to make adjustments and stuff. But she doesn't seem to have a motivation for doing that. She just simply, she tells, well, it just disturbs me to see stuff like this sewn like this. I'll just change it, you know? And so that, which is not in any kind of way to say something, I sympathize with Mrs. Wright and I'm trying to fix her up or etc. There's none of that has entered the picture yet. So she hasn't tried to suppress evidence. She's doing things kind of naturally, like a woman might do for another woman. Okay, let's go on. Yeah.
Bad sewing always made me fidgety.
I don't think we ought to touch things.
I'll just finish up this end.
Suddenly stopping and leaning forward.
Mrs. Peters.
Yes, Mrs. Hale?
What do you suppose she was so nervous about?
Oh, I don't know. I don't know as she was nervous. I sometimes so awful queer when I'm just tired.
Mrs. Hale starts to say something, looks at Mrs. Peters, then goes on sewing.
Well, I must get these things wrapped up. They may be thorough sooner than we think.
Putting apron and other things together.
I wonder where I can find a piece of paper and string.
In that cupboard, maybe.
Mrs. Peter looking in cupboard.
Why, here's a bird cage.
Holds it up.
Did she have a bird, Mrs. Hale?
Well, I don't know whether she did or not. I've not been here for so long. There was a man around last year selling canaries cheap, but I don't know how she took one. Maybe she did. She used to sing real pretty herself.
Mrs. Peters, glancing around.
Seems funny to think of a bird here, but she must have had one, or why would she have a cage? I wonder what happened to it.
I suppose maybe the cat got it.
No, she didn't have a cat. She's got that feeling some people have about cats, being afraid of them. My cat got in her room and she was real upset and asked me to take it out.
My sister Bessie was like that. Queer, ain't it?
Mrs. Peters, examining the cage.
Why, look at this door. It's broke. One hinge is pulled apart.
Mrs. Hale, looking too.
Looks as if someone must have been rough with it.
Why, yes.
She brings the cage forward and puts it on the table.
I wish if they're going to find any evidence they'd be about it. I don't like this place.
But I'm awful glad you came with me, Mrs. Hale. It would be lonesome for me sitting up here alone.
It would, wouldn't it?
Dropping her sewing.
But I tell you what I do wish, Mrs. Peters. I wish I had come over sometimes when she was here.
Looking around the room.
Wish I had.
But of course you were awful busy, Mrs. Hale. Your house and your children.
I could have come. I stayed away because I weren't cheerful. And that's why I ought to have come. I never liked this place. Maybe because it's down in a hollow and you don't see the road. I don't know what it is, but it's a lonesome place and always was. I wish I'd come over to see Minnie Foster sometimes. I can see now.
Shakes her head.
Well, you mustn't reproach yourself, Mrs. Hale. Somehow we just don't see how it is with other folks until something comes up.
Not having children makes less work, but it makes a quiet house. And Wright out of work all the time and no company when he did come in. Did you know John Wright, Mrs. Peters?
No, I've seen him in town. They say he was a good man.
Yes, good. He didn't drink and kept his word as well as most, I guess, and paid his debts. But he was a hard man, Mrs. Peters, just to pass the time of day with him. Like a raw wind that gets to the bone.
Pauses, her eye falling on the cage.
I should think she would have wanted a bird, but what do you suppose went with it?
I don't know, unless it got sick and died.
She reaches out and swings the broken door. Swings it again. Both women watch it.
You weren't raised around here, were you?
Mrs. Peters shakes her head.
You didn't know her?
Not till they brought her yesterday.
Come to think of it, she was kind of like a bird herself. Real sweet and pretty, but kind of timid and fluttery. She did change.
Silence, then as if struck by a happy thought and relieved to get back to everyday things.
Tell you what, Mrs. Peters, why don't you take the quilt in with you? It might take up her mind.
Why, I think that's a real nice idea, Mrs. Hale. There couldn't possibly be any objection to it, could there? Now, just what would I take? I wonder if her patches are in here, and her things.
They look in the sewing basket.
Here's some red. I expect this has got sewing things in it.
Brings out a fancy box.
What a pretty box. Looks like something somebody would give you. Maybe her scissors are in here.
Opens box. Suddenly puts her hand to her nose.
Why?
Mrs. Peters bends nearer, then turns her face away.
There's something wrapped up in this piece of silk.
Why, this isn't her scissors.
Mrs. Hale lifting the silk.
Oh, Mrs. Peters, it's...
Mrs. Peters bends closer.
It's the bird.
Mrs. Hale jumping up.
But Mrs. Peters, look at it. Its neck. Look at its neck. It's all to the other side.
Somebody wrung its neck.
Their eyes meet, a look of growing comprehension, of horror. Steps are heard outside. Mrs. Hale slips box under quilt pieces and sinks into her chair. Enter sheriff and county attorney. Mrs. Peter rises. County attorney, as one turning from serious things to little pleasantries.
Well, ladies, have you decided whether she was going to quilt it or not it?
We think she was going to knot it.
Well, that's interesting, I'm sure.
Seeing the bird cage.
Has the bird flown?
Mrs. Hale putting more quilt pieces over the box.
We think the cat got it.
County attorney preoccupied.
Is there a cat?
Mrs. Hale glances in a quick, covert way at Mrs. Peters.
Well, not now. They're superstitious, you know. They leave.
County attorney to Sheriff Peters, continuing in interrupted conversation.
No sign at all of anyone having come from the outside. their own rope. Now, let's go up again and go over it piece by piece.
They start upstairs.
It would have to have been someone who knew just the...
Mrs. Peters sits down. The two women sit there, not looking at one another, but as if peering into something and at the same time holding back. When they talk now, it is in the matter of feeling their way over strange ground, as if afraid of what they're saying, but as if they cannot help saying it.
She liked the bird. She was going to bury it in a pretty box.
When I was a girl, my kitten, there was a boy took a hatchet, and before my eyes, and before I could get there,
Covers her face in an instant.
if they hadn't held me back, I would have
Catches herself, looks upstairs where steps are heard, falters weakly.
hurt him.
Mrs. Hale with a slow look around her.
I wonder how it would seem never to have any children around. No, Wright wouldn't like the bird. A thing that sang, she used to sing. He killed that too.
Mrs. Peters moving uneasily.
We don't know who killed the bird.
I knew John Wright.
It was an awful thing that was done in this house that night, Mrs. Hale. Killing a man while he slept, slipping a rope around his neck that choked the life out of him.
His neck choked the life out of him.
Her hand goes out and rests on the birdcage. Mrs. Peter with rising voice.
We don't know who killed him. We don't know.
Mrs. Hale, her own feeling not interrupted.
If there had been years and years of nothing, then a bird to sing to you, it would be awful. Still, after the bird was still.
Mrs. Peters, something within her speaking.
I know what stillness is. When we homesteaded in Dakota and my first baby died after he was 2 years old and me with no other then.
Mrs. Hale moving.
How soon do you suppose they'll be through looking for the evidence?
I know what stillness is.
Pulling herself back.
The law has got to punish crime, Mrs. Hale.
Mrs. Hale, not as if answering that.
I wish you'd seen Minnie Foster when she wore a white dress with blue ribbons and stood up there in the choir and sang.
I look around the room.
Oh, I wish I'd come over here once in a while. That was a crime. That was a crime. Who's going to punish that?
Mrs. Peters looking upstairs.
We mustn't take on.
I might have known she needed help. I know how things can be for women. I tell you, it's queer, Mrs. Peters. We live close together and we live far apart. We all go through the same things. It's all just a different kind of same thing.
Brushes her eyes, noticing the bottle of fruit, reaches for it.
If I was you, I wouldn't tell her her fruit was gone. Tell her it ain't. Tell her it's all right. Take the sin to prove it to her. She may never know whether it was broke or not.
Mrs. Peters takes the bottle, looks about for something to wrap it in, takes petticoat from the clothes brought from the other room, very nervously begins winding this around the bottle in a false voice.
My, it's a good thing the men couldn't hear us. Wouldn't they just laugh, getting all stirred up over a little thing like a dead canary, as if that could have anything to do with, wouldn't they laugh?
The men are heard coming down the stairs. Mrs. Hale under her breath.
Maybe they would. Maybe they wouldn't.
No, Peters, it's all perfectly clear except the reason for doing it. But you know juries when it comes to women. There was some definite thing, something to show, something to make a story about, a thing that would connect up with a strange way of doing it.
The women's eyes meet for an instant. Enter Hale from outer door.
Well, I've got the team around. Pretty cold out there.
I'm going to stay here a while by myself.
To the sheriff.
You can send Frank out for me, can't you? I want to go over everything. I'm not satisfied that we can't do better.
Do you want to see what Mrs. Peters is going to take in?
The lawyer goes to the table, picks up the apron, laughs.
Oh, I guess they're not very dangerous things the ladies have picked out.
Moves a few things, disturbing the quilt pieces which cover the box, steps back.
No, Mrs. Peters doesn't need supervising. For that matter, a sheriff's wife is married to the law. Everything goes that way, Mrs. Peters?
Not just that way.
Sheriff chuckling.
Married to the law.
Moves toward the other room.
I just want you to come in here a minute, George. We ought to take a look at these windows.
County attorney scoffingly.
Oh, windows.
We'll be right out, Mr. Hale.
Hale goes outside. The sheriff follows the county attorney into the other room. Then Mrs. Hale rises, hands tight together, looking intensely at Mrs. Peters, whose eyes make a slow turn, finally meeting Mrs. Hale's. A moment Mrs. Hale holds her, then her own eyes point the way to where the box is concealed. Suddenly Mrs. Peters throws back quilt pieces to try and put the box in the bag she's wearing. It's too big. She opens the box, starts to take the bird out, cannot touch it, goes to pieces, stands there helpless. Sound of a knob turning in the other room. Mrs. Hale snatches the box and puts it in the pocket of her big coat. Enters county attorney and sheriff. County attorney, fascist,
Well,
whatever that word is.
at least we found out that she was not going to quilt it. She was going to, what is it you call it, ladies?
Mrs. Hale, her hand against her pocket.
We call it not it, Mr. Henderson.
Curtain.
Okay. Thank you. Good job, guys. Good job. Okay, so so we have a whole big portion of the play, nearly half of the play, which sets up the circumstances around which we are going to get close to. What is the inciting incident? That is what starts towards the climax of the play.
The discovery of the bird.
Good. Okay. How about the rest of you? Do you agree with that? Does that sound reasonable? Okay. So the discovery of the bird. Why not the discovery of the bird cage?
I think because it's probably because, I mean, okay, there was the broken door, but truth be told, they still didn't exactly know it could have been. They still suspected like a cat had gotten it, but then once they actually see the bird and the really odd circumstances as to its death, they begin to.
They put two and two together. They start piecing together a puzzle that they're answering, but they don't necessarily, none of these women claim that they are doing this deliberately. They're kind of doing it intuitively, right? When these women come, they don't set out to find evidence. And ultimately, they begin to get into a situation where they start piecing all these things together. And Mrs. Hale almost describes Minnie Foster as being, she's kind of a special figure that's idealized. She sang well. She sang in the church choir. It's sad that she had no children. She had to live in a household that was very cold. The husband seemed to be very cold. So essentially, it begins to set up a picture of harassment. If anything, the suggestion is that her husband was not a very nice person. He was cold and somewhat indifferent, and that if in fact he killed the bird, that it could have triggered Minnie's desire, because by killing the bird, it kills her. You see, because she sings like the bird. So she had to save herself, and part of this was by finding a way to do something to him. So she's taken revenge for the killing of the bird. How many of you sympathize with what's happened? Sympathize with these women, and what? After all, what have they done? They're suppressing evidence. They're suppressing evidence, and they are keeping the county attorney from getting the evidence that he may need to put a case together against Mrs. Wright. And one of the key things that happens is that the county attorney says he's going to stay there. I'm going to stay there and just see, there must be something I'm missing, which is the final thing that makes Mrs. Wright and Mrs. Peters deal with the bird. Yes, you had a question. No? Nope. Okay. So does that make sense? Then essentially what we're doing here is constructing a scenario in which these women are committing a crime. by suppressing evidence. But is it a crime that we have to forgive because of the nature of the circumstances? What things were happening in this period in time? Play. You have to look at when the play was done and when the play was written, and about what period of time it was written, and how that might affect the interpretation of what's happening. What was happening in 1918?
Was this the Spanish flu?
Yep, it sure was. Killed millions of people, the same as the pandemic today. And the other thing was that women, what was women's role in society at that time in America?
Just to be a mother and a wife.
Okay. Anything else to add to that? They could not vote, and they could not serve on juries. And so the playwright wrote a short novello after she wrote this play called A Jury of Her Peers. And so consequently, Mrs. Wright was acquitted, in a sense, in the minds of these women by a jury of her peers. So the whole intention of the play is to support that notion that without a fair judicial approach to her circumstances, Mrs. Wright's circumstances, then she is, in a sense, by the women, forgiven for the crime that she's done. Now, today, of course, I don't know whether you'd want something to happen like that for you or for someone else, but there are plenty of circumstances concerning the thing that happened in New York and Washington recently, in which there are people that have been brought up on crimes they may or may not have committed at the Capitol. But you have to say that there's going to be an attempt to support some of these individuals on the basis of what has gone on before. And we'll see what happens. But this particular instance is a good example of how the playwright has made a strong statement about women's rights without actually having them say that they're going to commit a crime, because they don't say that at all. They don't say that, and they do everything it's quiet. The county attorney having told them that he's going to stay on, he's not going to go into town with them and see, he's going to look around. They virtually have to take the bird with them in order to keep him from finding it and putting two and two together like they've done. So this is again one of those plot structures that has helped to support a particular notion by the playwright. Controversial, but important in part because we've set it in a totally different time frame from that of today. So you can kind of buy into what has occurred. Okay, so there are particular things about the approach to analysis that I want to remind you of, but I'm not going to do it right now. So, and they come from David Ball, and so when we come on Thursday, I will make some presentation to you about how he goes about analyzing plays and how this kind of all fits in together with the way both of these writers, Prittner and Walters and Ball, have some similar methods of analyzing plays. It's just that there are some significant differences, and which we're going to talk about later. Okay, so what I'd like you to do whenever you get a chance, and the sooner the better, is to answer those questions about what you think about this play. There's a set of questions to ask about any play that I have, and I've set up the place where you can deposit that information online. Okay, how many of you, hopefully all of you, have filled out your Who Am I page? Yes, some of you. Anybody missing it right now? No. Okay, good. So be sure to do that so that I can take a look at it. I'd like to kind of finish all those by Thursday at the latest, and then start working on your evaluation of this particular play as you've experienced it. Okay. Fallon, I just want to congratulate you on your performance in Breathe. It was very good. And hopefully we'll take a look at the script. We'll take a look at the performance in class.
Okay.
She did an online version of a piece that was created by Frida Scott Giles, one of our former faculty members. Okay, so any questions? You're all set. You can go eat, have dinner, do something else. Okay, I'll see you on Thursday, and then we'll go through the sort of overview of a performance. Okay, I have to answer the phone. Goodbye.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.